All right, everyone. I would say that we can start. I still see people coming in, but in the interest of time, welcome and good afternoon to everyone. It's great to see so many people here in the room and hopefully also online. So, welcome to our side event co-organized by the Paris-based think tank IDDRI and the European Commission. As you are well aware, our side event is focusing on how we can keep the 1.5 alive. And we're looking into emission data as a first part of the presentations, then into the pathways that are forward-looking, and also into implementation enablers that are basically showing us how these pathways can be implemented. We do have a quite packed agenda today, so we will start with some introductory words from Vicky Pollard from a DG Klima perspective. And then we will have 3 presentations from the JRC ISPRA, from PBL, and from IDDRI, followed by a Q&A in the end. So I would ask you to just keep your questions until the end, and I think that's probably the best in terms of the time management, given that we only have the slot until 2:30. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our participants. And although you have an all-male panel here, you have an all-female panel online. So I would like to just say that we are in gender parity in total. Just to let you know, online you have Vicky Pollard, who is head of unit of in DG Klima of the unit for foresight, economic analysis and modeling. You have online as well Monica Crippa, who is in the Air and Climate Unit in JRC ISPRA, JRC being the Joint Research Council. And you have online as well Jessie Burton, who is a researcher in energy systems at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, as well as a senior associate at the E3G. And then here in front of you, you have to the left, to the furthest left from my side, so to the furthest right from your side, Johannes Svensson, who is a research fellow at IDDRI, focusing on climate and land use, and Ioannis Dafnomilis, who is a researcher at the Department of Climate, Air and Energy in the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL. And I have the pleasure to moderate this side event today. My name is Andreas Fazekas. I am also in the European Commission in DG Klima in the unit of Vicky Pollard working on international mitigation. So, as a first start to give us a little bit of context and also the right framing for this event, I would like to ask Vicky to give us some introductory remarks on the topic of keeping 1.5 alive. Over to you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and it's a pleasure to be with you, if only online. So during the side event, we will focus on 3 key elements for to be successful to stay in line with the 1.5 degree goal. First of all, understanding where we are today. So what is the composition of our global greenhouse gas emissions, the contribution of sectors, of regions, and the developments in the last decade. And this is the work that will be presented by Monica, a colleague from the JRC's EDGAR team. Secondly, we need to understand where we need to go, how we can reduce emissions efficiently, and what the impacts of our policies and pledges will have on the global temperature. And this is the work of our colleagues at PBL, here in the room with you. And finally, understanding how we get there, how global enablers can accelerate the implementation on the ground, and what barriers need to be addressed and dismantled. So this is the work that IDDRI is looking at with partners under the Imagine project. So I know in this bunk session, the global stocktake is one of the major topics, and there are both converging views on certain topics, as well as parties expressing different views. And what's clear that what we can all agree on is the science and facts provided to us by the IPCC and other institutions, including those here in the room. And what we know from that is that globally, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035 compared to 2019 levels. Gaining these insights would not be possible without the work of the colleagues in JRC and PBL, providing us with impartial and independent understanding of our status quo and what is cost efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emissions pathways, so that we can realise the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's important for our current understanding and to be able to progress for the future of the world and basically generations to come. And I think it's important to restate that these modelling exercises and the greenhouse gas accounting are impartial and independent, and in fact very transparent. And I know that in the last days there have been comments on net zero pathways, including those provided by the IPCC. I know that the teams are working to show us what cost-efficient pathways mean, including as many of the different impacts as possible, and always working to improve the representation of the models so that we can really represent and maximise the benefits of the transition and keeping the costs to all of us to a minimum, so that we can basically achieve a transition, ambitious transition that leaves no one behind. That's very important. What is essential for gaining the benefits in terms of employment, in terms of security of energy supply, in terms of the impact on our sustainable growth for the future, is to look at the national expertise for the transitions, and in particular, national expertise in terms of accounting, modelling and implementation of climate policies and regulations, and making sure that climate expertise comes together with decision makers. And that's what we're looking at in the Imagine project, creating and strengthening the in-country capacity and knowledge so that the transition to net zero could be driven from an in-country perspective based on accounting and modelling. And what that allows national circumstances to be considered, national barriers to be removed, and national opportunities to be created. In the Imagine project, we have a consortium of in-country experts from China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, with Jess in the room with us, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, as well as the European Union, all working to improve the expertise through exchanges, working together to learn, and providing new resources for modelling capacity. From our perspective, this is really the way forward in terms of providing global analysis linked with country expertise. And we hope that what we know at the global level, what we know is necessary at the global level, can be transferred into the important messages and narrative at the national level, so that to bring everybody together behind a successful transition. So I hope you find this event interesting, and I'm sorry that I won't be able to stay with you, but I have to rush off to on a mission elsewhere. But I hope you have a very good discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing all about it from Andreas later on. Thanks, bye-bye.
All right, thank you very much, Vicky, for those introductory remarks. And sticking to the tight time schedule, I would just like to pass directly on to Monica to give us the latest insights on the JRC ISPRA work on global GHG emissions. Over to you, Monica.
Thanks, Andreas. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica Crippa from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Could you please share the screen so that I see it? Now it's not, I do not see the presentation. Okay, thanks, perfect. So in this presentation, I will give some insights on global greenhouse gas emissions as provided by the JRC IDDRI database. Next slide, please. Next. So EDDRI is the emissions database for global atmospheric research, which is developed by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and provides a historic time series of greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions for all countries and all sectors. Starting in 1970 till nowadays, typically till T-1. The key features of EDDRI are its global coverage and global consistency. In fact, we apply a consistent methodology for estimating greenhouse gas emissions for all countries and sectors, following the IPCC guidelines, typically Tier 1 and Tier 2 methods. So the EDDRI estimates provide an independent view on country, regional and global greenhouse gas emissions compared to what is officially reported by the parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And for this reason, they serve multiple purposes. They are policy relevant, but they are also very much widely used by scientific communities in the field of emission inventories, but also in atmospheric modeling exercises. All the EDDRI data are completely free and accessible on the EDDRI website. And in addition to the time series of emissions for all sectors and countries, we do also provide gridded data at 10 by 10 kilometers. Next slide, please. So how can the EDDRI data be supportive for the preparation of the global carbon stocktake of this year? As mentioned, EDDRI provides an independent view compared to the official reporting under the UNFCCC of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is done through the application of a consistent methodology. And this is in line and supports the enhanced transparency framework set by the Paris Agreement. And in particular, providing global greenhouse gas emissions for all countries in the world, we complete also the official reporting by the parties under the UNFCCC. And providing independent estimates, it's also a way to assess the reporting itself, doing comparisons, but also providing support to those countries who do not have robust statistical infrastructure or to support their improvement in the emission estimates, but while providing first estimate based on reference guidelines, such as those of the IPCC. A key feature of EDDRI is really related with the fact that every year we publish in a timely way greenhouse gas emissions for all countries up to the year T-1. This is particularly relevant considering the relevance of the greenhouse gas trends in the latest years, in particular in the last decade, but also considering the remaining and the limited carbon budget that's still available. And finally, as mentioned, the EDDRI data supports also inverse modeling activities and the development of independent verification systems. Next slide, please. So all the EDDRI scientific work, it's actually contributing to many science for policy products. First of all, the EDDRI data are used and considered as reference for historic global greenhouse gas emissions in the 6th assessment report by the Working Group 3 on mitigation. On a yearly basis, we contribute to the United Nations Environment Programme emission gap report while providing global and regional and sector-specific time series of greenhouse gas emissions, always updated till the latest years to understand trend and drivers of these emissions. And together with DigiClima colleagues, we participate at side events at the Conference of the Parties on a yearly basis, showing and sharing the latest findings and developments of the EDDRI work. And all these data are published in a yearly Science for Policy report that's typically coming out in September every year. And last year, we also contributed with a global perspective of greenhouse gas emissions to DigiClima's Climate Action Progress Report, and we intend to continue this cooperation between science and policy with this joint work. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at how the IDDRI data are estimated. So emissions are estimated by country, for each country and sector, following the IPCC guideline. And in particular, in a very simplified way, we can say that emissions make use of information on activity data and emission factors. And then obviously the modeling is, it depends varies for each sector. But just to give you an idea on how we collect all the data. So we need to, first of all, gather data on activity data based on international statistics, such as the International Energy Agency fossil fuel balances, or making use of FAO statistics on crops, livestock, and many other data sources, looking at each individual sector, also all industrial activities, for example. Then we extend these estimates up to the year T-1 through the development and application of a fast-track methodology, which makes use of the latest statistics for the different sectors. For example, for fossil fuels, we rely on British petroleum data, or some estimates of biofuels from FAO, or USDA statistics for crops and livestock, and many, many others. And finally, once we have estimated sector and country-specific emissions at national level, we downscale them over the globe at 10 by 10 kilometers, making use of over 300 layers, which of spatial information proxies, which allow us to distribute over the space, over the globe, the different type of sources. Point sources are typically power plants, industries, which are located at the exact location of where they happen, while, for example, we rely on transportation network for road transport emission, or ship tracks, and many, many other data sources. Each of these steps in the emission calculation is associated with data quality check and accuracy, but also emission estimation uncertainty. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at few results. So this is a global picture of global greenhouse gas emission trends from 1970 till 2021. So published last year. This is why we are at 2021. And the color codes represented a different contribution of the various greenhouse gases. So around 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from CO2. Then we have methane in orange, N2 in gray, and fluorinated gases, while the green component represent the net sink of first gas estimate from the land use change and forestry sector. This picture already highlights the relevance of having a long time series of data, because it supports the analysis of trends and specific events, not only at the global level, but at country and regional level, thus supporting the evaluation of the effectiveness of mitigation actions as well. And if we look over time, for example, we are able to detect periods of crisis, such as the oil crisis in the 70s, or a financial crisis in the year 2000s, or even geopolitical changes, such as the Soviet Union collapse in the 90s, or the change in the economies on the market growth, for example, of China from 2000 onwards. And more recently, obviously, we were able also to track the effect of the COVID pandemic, which resulted in a decrease at the global level of 4.1%. Of global greenhouse gas emissions, with a rebound effect the year after by 4.3%. Next slide, please. So where do we stand? This map shows for each country the comparison of today's emissions against the 1990 level, so the year for the base year for emission reporting. And so there's a series of countries which have been decreasing their emissions, typically those represented in greenish colors, while there are many countries in yellow and orange and red whose emissions are still increasing. Next slide, please. And in particular, in 2021, 6 top emitting economies contributed for 63% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And those were China contributing for a third, then the US for 11% of the global total, India 7%, together with the European Union, Russia for 5%, and then Brazil for 3%. Next slide, please. But which are the sectors that are emitting most? So globally, we see that 70% of greenhouse gas emission comes from combustion-related sources. Power generation, industry, transport, residential combustion. This figure is also reflected by China, industrialized countries such as the European Union or US, but different picture can be found in different countries and regions in the world. For example, if we look at Latin America and Africa, we see that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions is associated to non-combustion related sectors such as agriculture, or fuel supply chain, or even the waste sector. Next slide, please. So this is why in the latest years we have been working within the EDDRI database and project to further extend our understanding of non-combustion related sectors, and in particular with the development of the agricultural emission estimation tool, we aimed at supporting the EU member states in first instance for their reporting obligations for greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions from agriculture under the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directive and the UNFCCC one. And in particular, having a common tool, one tool to estimate both greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions allows to get a coherent picture regarding different policies addressing the same sector. And on the other hand, we also developed the EDDRI Food, which is the first global greenhouse gas and air pollutant emission inventory addressing food systems. And actually, this EDDRI Food exercise and tool allowed to move from a source-based approach towards a different step. Next step, it's looking at systems, and in particular at food systems that's not only related with agriculture but energy, so it's very wide and complex. Next slide, please. And as mentioned, EDDRI, in addition of having a historic time series of data, it also provides spatially distributed emissions at the global level, 10 by 10 kilometers, which are used as input for atmospheric models, modeling exercises, but which are widely used in the field of atmospheric inversions to support the improvement of emission reporting, but also to support the development of independent verification systems, as it has been developed, for example, by many projects or Horizon projects, such as the Verify one. Next slide, please. And finally, in order to track the progress towards long-term goals, we are in the phase of developing the EDDRI Pulse JRC tool, which harmonizes the historic picture of emissions as provided by the EDDRI database that we have seen until now, with future emission scenarios as provided by the energy model Pulse, that stands for Prospective Outlook on a Long-Term Energy System Model, under different scenarios. So typically we have the current policy scenario, but also 1.5 degree scenario and many others. And this work is ongoing and it's going to be published later this year. And next slide to conclude. So when thinking about the global carbon stocktake, which aims at addressing the collective progress towards climate targets, we need to know historical emissions to understand where do we stand compared to the targets or the pathways to 2030 emissions. And to do so, we need to make use of the latest and most up-to-date information up to the year T-1, having a complete coverage and covering the entire time series as provided by the IDDRI independent view of country-specific, regional and global greenhouse gas emissions. And this aims at really supporting the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Monica. Before I pass over to Johannes from PBL to look at the pathways and the net zero modeling, I would just like to add that for everyone here in the room who is working with data and looking at the GHG emissions, I can only recommend to check out the IDDRI website and the JRC IDDRI website. There's a lot of useful information there, and again, it's available to everyone. There are country sheets and so on and so forth. So, highly recommended to check out the website of the JRC IDDRI accounting. And now I will pass on to the next presentation to Johannes, presenting the work of PBL on pathways.
Thank you, Andreas. Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Ioannis Dafnomilis. I'm working at PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and we'll be having a look at the work we've been doing on net zero targets. The presentation is...
Do we need to do something here in front to change the presentation? Just asking to, yeah? Yes. Okay, maybe just the clicker. Oh. Let's see. It's me. Okay, sorry. Here you go.
All right, yeah. So we're looking into the work we've been performing with the image model, which is one of the models that is providing scenario ensembles to the IPCC. It's the image model is the one we use at PBL as well. So you've probably heard this already this past 10 days, but in order to limit the human-caused global warming, we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions. And it is actually these cumulative carbon emissions in combination with reduction in other greenhouse gases that can determine whether we can limit the temperature to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees with a high confidence. And all this is in an attempt to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions, all types of sources, and removals by sinks, natural and anthropogenic as well. If we have a look at the recent IPCC report, we can see that in order to reach the 2-degree target, we need to reach net global CO2 emissions by 2070, but we also need to reduce emissions rapidly in the short term as well. For the 1.5-degree target, it is essential that emissions peak before 2025, 2 years from now, and we need a 43% reduction, like Vicky mentioned before, by 2030 in order to reach net zero CO2 emissions around 2050. That is a more challenging fact because, the climate budget for 1.5 degrees is almost depleted. There's only 380 gigatons remaining, which is more or less 9 years under current rate of emissions. And the current policies, so the business as usual scenario, the path we are on to right now, leads to a 2.5 to even 3.5 degree warming by the end of the century. There are still options to remain on the 1.5 degree track, but we need to rapidly accelerate our efforts to get there. And now, if we look into how close are we to a 1.5 degree, this is the current policy scenario trajectory predictions from the image model compared to the 1.5 degree scenario. So you can see the gap by the end of the century is more than 60 gigatons. And under current trajectory, we are at around 3.4 degrees Celsius mean temperature increase by 2100. If we implement the NDCs, and this is an implementation of all conditional NDCs, we get to 2.7 degrees by 2100. And this is called the so-called implementation gap between where we are now and what countries have promised to implement under their NDCs proposal. But this still leaves a quite sizable ambition gap, which is the emissions gap between the pledges, the NDC pledges, and the 1.5 degree scenario. So we had a look on countries with net zero commitments, and this is a plotting of image regions which have promised or have a plan to achieve net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions against their GDP per capita. And I will come back to this plot later to explain why we plotted it this way. So if we take every net zero commitment into account, this leads to a scenario looking like this. We do achieve a temperature increase just below 2 degrees, so 1.9. And we assume that also that countries under this scenario follow their NDC trajectory until 2030 and then can reach their net zero pledges. But if we are a bit more ambitious and we say, let's start implementation right now, if the NDC scenario, if the NDC target is less ambitious than a straight emission pathway to net zero, we can have an aligned scenario where we basically rush to the net zero targets, and this brings us to a temperature increase of around 1.7 degrees. The emission level at the end of the century is similar to the net zero pledge scenario, but due to a lot less cumulative CO2 emissions, we have this temperature decrease, basically. Still, that leaves us with a remaining ambition gap that we somehow need to cover. And what we did in PBL was we come up with a relatively simple, straightforward scenario where you basically assign net zero targets to every single country based on their GDP per capita and following this relation that we have with countries that have already expressed a net zero commitment. So now every single region or country has a net zero target, and we call this a broadening scenario, which basically further closes the gap to 1.5 degree. In this scenario, we achieve net zero greenhouse gases by 2070, and we have a temperature increase of 1.6 degrees by the end of the century. And we even tried several variations of further strengthening this scenario by moving the net zero targets forward 5 or even 10 years, and which has marginal results because moving the net zero years forward doesn't really make a lot of difference for respective countries. It's not feasible for most of the countries to achieve their net zero targets earlier than the announced year. And so basically we have, by broadening and strengthening net zero pledges, we have covered more or less 90% of the emissions gap between current policies and 1.5 degrees, but we still have some work to get to the actual target. If we have a more detailed look now into what sectoral or regional impacts will be from under these scenarios, we have broken up the world in 3 different regions: OECD region, non-OECD region with net zero target, and non-OECD without a net zero target. So OECD regions, except Mexico, they all have announced a net zero pledge so far, and they have a fairly ambitious NDC scenario. So you can see that implementing the NDCs, if they actually implement the NDCs as they have announced, almost gets us to net zero already. And then implementing the net zero targets covers the last 1.5 gigatons of emissions to net zero. For the non-OECD countries that have net zero target announcement, as it's clear, the implementation step, so basically implementing their net zero targets, is the most crucial one. But achieving net zero is not possible under any of the scenarios. Similar to the non-OECD regions without the target, this is where the broadened scenario comes into play, and that is what makes a difference and gets us to similar results of the other regions. But as before, net zero achievement is still not possible. And as you can see, it's the electricity sector in pink and the FOLU sector in green that have the lion's share of emission reductions. And it's clear that non-CO2 in the gray column bar is quite hard to abate. And if we have a look into primary energy results, we can see that under all scenarios, the primary energy production remains relatively the same, but there are several transition steps that need to be made from the current policy to the 1.5 degree scenario. And there is a typo here. This should be abated fossils. that they should be the new norm, not unabated, obviously. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we have to move from all types of unabated fossil fuel use to carbon capture and storage combined with with fossil fuel use, and at the same time coupled with increasing renewables deployment, which you can see in terms of solar and wind use. Under these conditions, we don't have to have extensive use of carbon dioxide removal technologies. In our scenarios, we only consider BECCS, and that participation of BECCS is relatively low in any case. So if we were to sum up what I've just been through, implementation, both in terms of implementing the NDC targets and the net zero targets, is already a huge step, but it can only get us that far. We need to be more ambitious, and broadening the targets to more regions or countries can close part of the gap. But it is actually more important that we have a deeper and more sustained mitigation before the first half of the century, rather than trying to have more and more ambitious targets, moving net zero targets forward and forward in time. So that means moving to non-unabated fossil fuels as fast as possible, move towards electrification where possible in electric vehicles use and heat pumps in all types of buildings. And of course, we need to focus on first focus on the low-hanging fruit, so electrify power supply and negative emissions in power supply, and electrifying transport, which is relatively easier than focusing on non-CO2, at least for the first half of the century. And the most important part is that to keep in mind that, yeah, for stabilizing the temperature, just reaching CO2 neutrality is enough. We do need some non-CO2 reduction, but it's relatively unimportant for this part. For the greenhouse gas neutrality that is achieved later, that is where we need to invest heavily into non-CO2 reduction, and that is what would lead to a decrease in the global temperature eventually. Thank you, and look forward to your questions after.
Thanks so much, Johannes. If it's okay for you, I would like to take the questions exactly at the end. And Johannes was 2 minutes early with his presentation, so we will have more time for questions in the end. I will now pass over to Johannes from IDDRI to present the work of the Imagine project, which basically is the third step in this chain of action that we're presenting here, namely the implementation and the creation of in-country capacity. And as I know my role now in terms of changing the slides in the front, I'll be much quicker, and I'll pass over to Johannes.
Thank you very much. It's already very nice to be on a panel with two Johanneses. That's rare, but appreciated. No, I want to come in and talk a bit about our work on national pathways, national climate and development pathways, and their global enablers. So. I'm presenting here results from the Imagine project that we have been leading at IDDRI, so IDDRI and the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. We've worked on national decarbonization pathways with in-country research teams for 10 years, since a few years before the Paris Agreement. And in Imagine, we're working with, Vicky already counted the teams, but it's, to repeat quickly, it's Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, India, China, and Indonesia. So on the map, you also see some other countries that are in different shades of pink. And those are other countries that we're working with in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative, but that are not part of Imagine. I should mention also that the project's funded by the European Union, but of course the outputs are not necessarily reflective of their position. The Imagine project we've focused on, Vicky already presented the project really well, but I'll try to cover it very quickly. We focused on technical model improvements of national models. We focused on, we are still focusing on national pathway development with the in-country modeling teams in the 7 countries. Those pathways are still under development. So hopefully they'll be presented at COP this year and at other events. And we're also aligning this with work on national stakeholder engagement. That's on the national scale. On the international level, we're also trying to draw synthetic messages from the in-country work. And that's what I'll be focusing on here. So we've done some work with the 7 in-country research teams on identifying global enablers of ambitious national pathways. So what am I referring to when talking about global enablers? So basing this on adjustment of the IPCC. We're basically looking at international conditions that enhance the feasibility of the implementation of ambitious national low greenhouse gas development pathways. This could be in the areas of finance, trade, technological innovation or governance. And the goal of this work is to ensure that international cooperation on climate addresses these enablers so that international climate cooperation basically serves the purpose of enhancing national ambition increases. I will skip this slide actually and dive directly into work that we did on finance. So when working with the country teams on this, we identified finance, international finance, and improved access to international finance as one of the key international or global enablers of ambitious national pathways in the countries that we were working with. And the work we did there, basically first we were working to identify the national transformations that are necessary for increased national ambition, and especially the national transformations that also require additional finance. So each country basically identified a set of transformations that, one, are necessary for increased national ambition and also require additional finance for their implementation. And then we work to identify the key barriers to finance under sort of these transformations under existing international financial infrastructures. So of course, I also just want to say, of course, both domestic and international financial sources are relevant. Here we focus on international finance. And here, I want to see if it's big, maybe it's a slight bit small. Anyways, I'll go through it. We found 6 different barriers for sort of barriers to the financing of 6 different types of transformations that were hard to finance under current sort of financial infrastructures. The first one being transformations. Transformations relying on actions by diffuse and small actors. So notably in the land use sector, which is also my sort of specialty sector, but many transformations there face the challenge of having to deal with many small and diffuse actors. So, for instance, one example that emerged in our work was forestry restoration in Brazil. Second, transformations requiring massive or sort of large-scale investments, where the sheer scale of the investments needed act as a barrier in and of itself. And there you could mention sort of hydro and nuclear developments in Argentina, which is a transformation that the team we're working with in Argentina wanted to focus on. Number 3 is transformations that rely on non-market technologies, non-mature technologies or markets. And there, I could mention as an example, the development of green hydrogen in India. So I'm halfway through, bear with me for a bit more. Transformation, the 4th category that we found was transformations requiring big upfront action in terms of research, construction, technology, etc. And here, you could mention sort of the strengthening and improvement of the grid, the electric grid in South Africa. That's one transformation that sort of faces this challenge in terms of its financing. Number 5 was transformations requiring an institutionalized market that does not currently exist. So, for instance, the forestry credits in Brazil, or phasing out of coal plants in China. And number 6, and the last one, is transformations that rely on a market that's currently too small for large-scale activities. And just to exemplify there, to make it a bit clearer, basically one example that came out was that in Argentina, the electrification of household end users is a very important transformation. However, households face budget constraints and struggle to invest in new sort of cooking technologies or electrical cooking instead of gas and so on. So that the market for electrification in households is a limit to the large scale electrification there. Based on that, we have drawn some recommendations. First, regarding international financial institutions, they should develop institutional frameworks and mechanisms that overcome these barriers, so that they can basically finance the full set of transformations that come out as priority based on country long-term strategies. So the set of transformations falling into the different categories I just presented. And second, analyze and report on this work, because we know that sort of reporting is very important. Second, long-term strategies are necessary or are very important, and it's important that they have details on the transformations. It's important that they are sort of built with domestic buy-in, so that they can sort of create a visibility on investment priorities. And last, it's important to have analysis that support this work, basically. And I want to hand, do I hand over to Jesse? Will basically continue on the South African perspective, but I might hand over to Andreas in between. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Johannes. I will directly pass the floor to Jesse, and I will put on your presentation, focusing on the South African case. Whenever you're ready. We are ready here, Jesse, and just let me know when you want to go to the next slide. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone, from a very cold and rainy South Africa. I understand it's very warm and nice there. Following on from Johannes 2's input, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the work that the team in South Africa have been doing in Imagine. Kind of on those last 3 points that Johannes had brought up, really using the modeling work that's been done to pull out some of the financing that's going to be needed, and also to start to think about some of the constraints to that, both in the long term and in the short term for NDC targets. Next slide, please. So some context first. This just shows on the left a breakdown of South Africa's emissions profile. We're a very coal-intensive economy, especially in the power sector. We get 90% of our electricity from coal. And so you can see electricity is almost half of our emissions, and our coal to liquids, we convert coal into liquid fuels, is another 12%. So more than half of South Africa's emissions come from coal. We have emissions of around 450 million tons in 2020. It may be a little bit higher now with some recovery from COVID. And in 2021, we submitted an updated NDC. The red bars on the right, that just shows our kind of preceding peak plateau and decline domestic targets, and the green lines show the 2025 and 2030 NDC. And it's just important to see them, because that 2030 range, which ranges from 350 to 420 million tons in 2030, it kind of exemplifies a much more ambitious set of interventions needed in the short term. So very much in line with what Johannes 1 was saying, we have to act very quickly in the short term to get to that lower range. You can jump to the next slide, please. And just again, there are lots of lines, don't worry too much about all the detail. This is just showing different methodologies for looking at what South Africa's fair share would be to the global effort for that range. And you can kind of see the 420 pips into 2 degrees using CATS methodologies. And it's 2 degrees compatible, and in some cases 1.5 using others. So it's quite important for South Africa to be 1.5 degree aligned, to move from that top end to that bottom end. That's our 1.5 degree pathway. And it comes with a lot more cost and effort, which I'll get to in a minute. Next slide, please. The rest of this context, just to also bear in mind, I think, is how coal intensive South Africa is. We're the most coal intensive energy system in the G20. I said 90% of electricity, but overall 66% of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from coal. And this graph is just some work done by the Production Gap Report, which just maps the share of workers in the coal mining sector for countries against national income. And so you can see there are a lot of kind of middle income or large emerging developing countries along the bottom here, for whom this is a much bigger challenge than it is for other countries. And yeah, I'll get to also what this how we see this coming out in the modeling. Thanks. Next slide. So last year and the year before, some preliminary results were done for the Department of Environmental Affairs on reaching net zero CO2 around 2050. There's different assumptions are traded off, different Indias. Overall, there are almost 100 scenarios, so I've just picked one to show you. I think what's most important to understand here is just the kind of scale of investment that's going to be needed when we start to look at net zero. So this comes from the World Bank CCDR for South Africa. Overall, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and just transition is costed at a $450 billion investment over the period in present value terms. In power, transport, and industry to 2050, that's $224 billion. And you can see why. I mean, this roughly coal power is the blue on the bottom and on the left. Coal kind of declines pretty smoothly down to 2040, where it's essentially phased out. The plants run a little bit, but they're basically phased out. Very small amounts of gas, as seasonal balancing, long duration energy storage, actually, and a huge build out of variable renewables, especially wind and solar. So we go from around 50 gigawatts installed capacity today to over 250 gigawatts installed capacity in 2050, and we triple electricity use because of the electrification of end users, the electrification of transport and industry. On the right, you can see how this looks for transport. We move from very dominated ICE system for minibus, taxis, buses, and private passenger cars, and those electrify very rapidly by around 2040, almost the entire market, in fact. And so it's critical in a place like South Africa, where the cost of capital is probably 2 or 3 times higher than in developed countries. There is a lot of capital investment that needs to happen up front. And, going back to Johannes's input, some of this doesn't have a market yet, or it's very diffuse. There's about probably $10 billion worth of investment in public charging infrastructure needed over the period, right? And there's currently not really a way to do that. So critically, these model results, which require around $50 billion in investment between now and 2030, are only consistent with the upper NDC for South Africa. And if you model a more ambitious scenario or sets of scenarios that get to the bottom of that range, and of course it's very sensitive to things like how much energy efficiency gets deployed, demand side management and the like. But roughly, to get from that upper range to that lower range, that 1.5 degree pathway in 2030, it's about a 4% knock on GDP. And that's because you're stranding some of that coal much more quickly, and you're deploying the renewables much faster, and you're deploying new grid much faster. That doesn't sound like a lot maybe to some countries, but we're already in a recession, a per capita recession in the country. We're facing power cuts of 12 hours a day. There's very high levels of poverty, the most unequal society in the world. So all of these impacts have huge amounts of social impact. And of course, when you go faster, you also increase your just transition investment needs. So next slide. So moving from that long-term perspective to 2050 to the short term of the NDC range, these are also just the multiple scenarios that were modeled as part of the work for the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. So you can go and look at them if you're interested. And they're just different scenarios showing either the lower NDC range, a mid NDC range, or an upper NDC range with and without energy efficiency. So this makes a large impact on investment, of course. And I think two of the most critical things to note is that in these low NDC range scenarios, you're roughly halving the output of the coal fleet between now and 2050. So you're moving from around 200 terawatt hours today to about 100 terawatt hours in 2030 to 2030. And associated to that is a huge upscaling in deployment of renewable energy. Moving from, we've got about 6 gigawatts of installed capacity of wind and solar. It's about 6% of electricity. And we're talking about deploying between 45 and 60 gigawatts over the next 6 years for that low end, for that 1.5 degree pathway. Next slide. So that shows you what that kind of translates into for that NDC range in terms of investments in the power sector. Two things to note. So the pace and timing is really sensitive to the cumulative emissions budget, like I've said. You can actually achieve in net zero in an end year without meeting the NDC or meeting only the top end of the NDC. And so that is really important in terms of the international finance flows, I think, and also what is a fair share. If you want to hit this 1.5, you have to go faster and you have to have much higher levels of investment. The blue block in the graph just shows you that the NDC range for 2030 and all the different scenarios and what they imply in terms of investment in billions of rands, sorry, not dollars, but it's about 20. And so that lower NDC range is basically around R1 trillion in the next 6 years, so about 54 billion US dollars, and that's in generation and in wires, so transmission and distribution strengthening, which is absolutely critical. At the moment, we have not been able to connect new renewables because we haven't invested sufficiently in the grid in the last 10 or 15 years. Next slide, please. So yeah, to translate all of those numbers and whatever into practical interventions, I mean, we're talking about scaling up the deployment of wind and solar by about 10 times. So commissioning that 6 gigawatts every single year or more, 7 or 8 gigawatts per year every year. It's at least an 8 times scale up of actual wires. So from around 300 kilometers per year to over 2,300. And in fact, those numbers are from the Eskom transmission plan, which is predated some of the NDC work, so it's actually probably higher than that. And for comparison, some of the work done in that World Bank CCDR looked at what would happen if you increased international financial flows. So how do we deal with that 4% GDP knock? And one of the findings is if you scale up international foreign investment in renewables, you need to kind of double it at least from existing climate finance inflows. But if you get that up to about $5 billion US a year, you can offset some of that GDP impact. And it's because South Africa is a very savings-constrained economy, so the FDI can be very valuable there. Next slide. So the picture on the right is from the JET investment plan. It just shows across the 3 sectors that are included in the IP, electricity, NEVs, and green hydrogen, where there's still some outstanding financing gaps. You can see the analysis that was done in the investment plan identified a lot of private sector investment that can go into these sectors. For example, in electricity, we've had only about 20% of our renewables has been FDI up until now. A lot of it has been domestically financed. But it's really important. South Africa's got a very well-developed financial sector in general. But this is a really great quote from some private finance experts who've been looking at this subsequent to the release of the JETP, which is that the quantum of funding required for the energy transition will soon exhaust domestic financing capacity without financial innovation and greater international flows. And I think this is a challenge that's not just for South Africa. It's going to face all sorts of emerging and developing economies. South Africa has very specific constraints also domestically, but there are a lot that are kind of cross-world, they're cross-global, related to the cost of capital, perceived and real political risks, forex and currency risks, public finance and kind of debt sustainability issues. For South Africa, we also have underpowered DFI balance sheets. There are issues around onerous reporting. And the work that Intellidex has done has really been also around appropriate instruments for moving investments off bank balance sheets quickly enough. Because at the moment, it takes about 5 years before a bank can on-sell some of this debt. And they're not doing that quickly enough to kind of accommodate this build-out. So some of this innovation has to happen domestically, but some also has to be international. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jessie. And we have roughly 10 to 12, 13 minutes left for turning the mic around now. And I'm looking at the audience. So I saw and I see that there are questions. Just a couple of points. As we have limited time, I would ask you to be brief also with the answers. Please also just quickly tell us who you are and who you want to address. And I realize that might be complicated with two Johannes on the stage. So just use maybe Johannes from PBL and Johannes from IDDRI, or use the numbering system as Jessie did. And then obviously the question itself. And I will take the mic and bring it to you. And I saw the two questions here first. So I'll go here, and then here, and then here. And please forgive me if I don't manage to have the exact order. Okay, this is on. That's good. Coming over here. Here you go.
Thank you. Paolo Bertoldi. I'm also from the GRC, but a different department from my colleagues, Edgar. My question to Ioannis from PBL. We focus very much on 2050, 2070. But can you say something on the peaking? All the scenarios close to 2 to 1.5 need very, very quick peaking. And we in 2023, we know most probably GDP projection for the next 2 year population projection. Have you modeled what should be done to peak by 2026 or certainly before 2030?
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Mila Wittmer. I'm from the Plant-Based Treaty Initiative, and I have a question regarding the low-hanging fruits that we briefly touched on, and it was electricity and transportation. And as the data has shown, agriculture also plays a big role, and the majority of it comes back to animal agriculture. And there, the solution is quite simple, which means shifting to plant-based foods like fruits and vegetables. They are safe and scalable in the majority parts of the world. So why are we not considering this as a low-hanging fruit?
I will just take 2 more questions and then maybe go back to you. I think you had one, and then I'll come over to you.
My name is Tim Werner from Plant-Based Treaty Initiative also. And I have a question for the lady from EDGAR. I don't remember her name, sorry. Regarding the time frame of the carbon equivalents for methane, because over 100 years, I think methane is very underestimated. And which time frame goes into the calculations?
All right, thanks so much. And the last question before I give it back to the panelists. Here you go. Sure.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Kim O'Dowd. I'm with the Environmental Investigation Agency. We hear a lot about, in this space, about abated and unabated fossil fuels, but I don't think everyone's clear with exactly what it means. So what definition do you use to define abated fossil fuels? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I head back to the panelists and would ask you to reply to those questions. And if we have time for a second round, then we do have a second round.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll answer the question from Paolo. Nice to see you in person as well, because I've read your name a lot in reports and papers. And yes, about the peaking. So indeed, it is actually very important that we peak as fast as possible. Like China, for example, has already in its NDC peaking before 2030, preferably by 2025. In these scenarios that we present here, we intentionally didn't prescribe any peaking constraint. And that is because it would be even more stringent than what you saw here, which was already quite ambitious. We assumed greenhouse gas neutrality for all countries. If they had a CO2 neutrality target, we translated that into a greenhouse gas target later in the century. We didn't impose any constraints on energy per capita use or anything like that. And it's still, with a very optimistic approach, it still falls quite short of reaching 1.5 degree and barely reaches 2 degrees. And we didn't want to focus on making a more stringent approach in the short term, which meant decreasing the peaking time. But we just wanted to show an exploratory scenario, just exploring the countries' announcements themselves without any external constraints on top of those. But yeah, indeed, so imagine that all what you saw would be much more stringent, let's say, the results that you would see. And the next question, I assume, was for me about the low-hanging fruit, right? Yeah, yeah, indeed. So behavioral change, which I would put like a shift into a different diet, is probably the second largest impact behavioral change could have outside of transport shift to more public transport use or electric vehicles. And it is indeed very important, but it is also much harder to model in this type of models. It is not a technological approach, but it's a social, institutional approach, which is much harder to put in a strict modeling framework. We do have a lot of scenarios that do work with diet change, specifically from meat to plant based, but this was not included in these scenarios, and we chose to focus more on the technological approach, which is much easier to implement as well, instead of trying to make a large percentage of the population shift their behavior. But yeah, it is, apart from transport shift mode, it is the second largest impact our decisions that could directly have on emissions, basically. And should I answer the unabated question before we move to Monica? Yeah, so basically, abated and unabated, by the term unabated fossil fuel, we mean fossil fuel used for electricity production that does not include any form of carbon capture. So it's just a normal power plant, coal or natural gas power plant we have now. Any type of effort to capture the CO2 produced by the operation of the plant, either for storage underground or in any type of chemical means, or for use in other activities, would be considered abated fossil fuel electricity production. So that's the way we use it in our work, at least. Thank you.
So, giving the floor to Monica.
Okay, thanks. Regarding methane, obviously each greenhouse gas has a different contribution in terms of radiative forcing, and specifically for the data that we have shown, we have been using the IPCC global warming potential over 100 years for methane from the year 4, so the 4th assessment report with a global warming potential value of 25. And the next version, we are going to move to the values of the 5th assessment report, where methane has a value of 28. Obviously, the new values of year 6 of IPCC are even higher for methane. So it's taking into account the relative contribution of the different gases in terms of radiative forcing. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think we still have a couple of minutes left, so if there are more questions in the room, I'm happy to take 2 or 3 more. I see one here. I will over there with the other mic. Here you go.
Thank you.
I got from the presentation from Johannes, IDDRI, and from your colleague in South Africa that finance and international cooperation can help really with the implementation of mitigation options. But I could see in your modeling, Ioannis, that you were suggesting a more fragmented approach with differentiated net zero target. Was that a parameter, or was that the result of a just globally cost-optimal allocation?
Hello, my name is Tony Slatcher. I'm here with the World Meteorological Organization. We've been involved in the last couple of days in some workshops and briefings on the issues of water connections to mitigation, emission reduction measures. And I'm just wondering I think this is for Johannes too, around the investment, I think. When you're thinking about the cost of investment requirements for measures, are you just looking at the measure itself, or are you also looking at the cost of measures which need to be put in place to enable those things? So for example, let's say you have a new hydrogen facility or a new biofuels investment, but that is dependent on water security and, for example, which is the thing we've been discussing, which is why I'm raising it here, the country would need to invest potentially in infrastructure to secure the water resources that would in turn make it possible to have that kind of measure occur without having an impact on food production or some other use of the water, particularly in a water scarce environment. So I'm just wondering if in your approach to this you are thinking of these sort of secondary investments that may be necessary to enable the primary investment. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Going back to the panel, just looking into the room if there's another question. Okay, one more, and then we'll go back to the panelists. Coming back here. Here you go.
Hi, thanks very much. This is Neil Grant from Climate Analytics. This is a question to Johannes 1. I just want to say thank you first. The broadening scenarios that you're developing here are really interesting. You mentioned that you have very low carbon dioxide removal. You said that you were only using BECCS. This is just a clarification. Is that, I'd like to know about the sinks in the land use sector. Is there no sequestration happening from afforestation and reforestation in your scenarios?
All right, I would say open the floor until I'm back at the panel.
Okay, so I guess I'm answering to Jan. Thanks for your question. Yeah, so the way we approach these scenarios is we don't approach it from a cost-optimal global perspective. So we basically prescribe the announced emission pathway for each country, and then we calculate the equivalent carbon tax that would lead that specific country or region to their net zero target. So, of course, since IMAGE is a cost-optimal model, each country's pathway is the output is in a cost-optimal way, but it is aggregated in the global level after each country's separate calculation. So it's not a global cost-optimal, but it's a region-specific cost-optimal approach. And the second question was about land sequestration. Yes, we do take into account, but in the graph that I showed, there's only primary energy production, so that is not shown here. But yeah, it is taken into account in the model, of course. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, and handing over to Johannes from IDDRI.
Thank you very much. No, yeah, thanks for a very good question. Basically, and correct me if I go in the wrong direction, but we are not doing any global modeling, basically, so we don't have one uniform modeling infrastructure. We have a decentralized modeling work where each country do their own, sort of according to their own models, building national pathways. There is, in most cases, there's no explicit sort of costing of each, the investments needed in each pathway. However, we do quite a lot of sort of feasibility analysis, or sort of what. So for instance, I mean, your question is very like relevant in that sense. So in India, where there is a increasing water stress, hydrogen requiring a lot of water is indeed something that this feasibility. I mean, this is work in progress, so that's a good point. So, but I mean, that's indeed something that this kind of feasibility analysis should pick up on. So I note that, and yeah, also as a general response to how we work more in terms of making sure that the pathways are feasible rather than sort of explicitly costing them. I hope that responds. Thanks.
All right, it's 2:30, so I guess this event is now officially wrapping up. I would first of all like to thank the speakers and panelists, both online. Thank you, Monica, thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Vicky, who already had to move on, as well as thanks to our two Johannes here. I think, and then second of all, thanks to you as an audience for your interest, for sacrificing your lunch break, which we really appreciate, and also for your questions that really helped to clarify and further give us food for thought. And just to quickly mention that, I think we heard that, we don't talk about the critical decade for no reason. We do see that we do have the data, we do have the information, we have the knowledge, and we know how to implement and also what the barriers are for implementation. So I guess closing this on a high note and on a hopeful note, let's use all of this was presented here, but also the information that we have from other sources, and let's start to act and increase our ambition and implementation efforts. Thank you so much.